Hey, thanks for listening to this episode of History's Greatest Battles. As always, feel free to send any thoughts by clicking the link at the bottom of the show notes. In preparation for this episode, I want to share a personal thought and a statement that has always brought a degree of reverence when I consider it. It's a rather cruel irony that the wartime brotherhood formed during the Mexican-American War between the American men who fought and bled together, especially those who fought at the Battle of Mexico City, which this episode today is on, would be torn asunder during the Civil War. And while the brotherhood and friendship may have waned, the respect didn't. In September of 1913, this segment was published in the Confederate Veteran magazine. Quote, Abraham Lincoln once asked General Winfield Scott this question: "Why is it that you were once able to take Mexico City in 3 months with 5,000 men, and we have been unable to take Richmond with 100,000 men?" "I will tell you," said General Scott. "The men who took us into Mexico City are the same men who are keeping us out of Richmond."
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 26, The Battle of Mexico City, August through September, 1847. As forces, 7 and 200 soldiers. Mexico City garrison of 16,000 soldiers. The American victory shattered the Mexican government, triggering its collapse and bringing a definitive end to the war. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848, cemented the terms of surrender. Through this treaty, the United States seized control of northern Mexico, gaining not just vast territories, but also securing its dominance in the Western Hemisphere. The war's conclusion marked the U.S. as the prevailing power on the continent, reshaping the balance of power across the Americas.
On April the 21st, 1836, the Texan forces, hardened by grit and desperation, crushed the Mexican army led by President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna at San Jacinto. As the dust of battle settled, a humiliated Santa Anna was forced to sign a surrender, his hand trembling, as he ceded the Rio Grande as the frontier of the newborn Republic of Texas. Though Mexico refused to acknowledge the surrender, dismissing it as a piece of paper born out of defeat, the Texans saw that border carved in stone. The Rio Grande, stretching from its mouth to its source, was now the lifeblood of their republic, a line they would defend with every fiber of their being. For 9 long years, Mexico, licking its wounds, made no real effort to reclaim the lost province. Its half-hearted raids were mere flickers of resistance, quickly snuffed out by a people who had tasted victory and would not be cowed. The land stretching from San Antonio to the distant settlement of Santa Fe was a savage and an untamed expanse, ruled not by the settlers or soldiers, but by the fierce Comanche, a tribe as skilled in the art of war as any in North America, their dominance unchallenged for a century. For 100 years, the Comanche had held back the tide of Spanish and Mexican encroachment, their lands untouched by foreign hands, their warriors feared by all who dared to venture too far. In the bold days of the Republic of Texas, a daring expedition was launched, cutting through the heart of Comanche territory, and their goal was Santa Fe, the jewel to be seized and claimed for Texas. Yet the expedition faltered, defeated and captured just within sight of their prize. But even in failure, the Texans staked a frail claim to the land, for they had dared to cross it, something the Mexicans had never accomplished. Mexico, unwilling to relinquish its pride, declared the Nueces River as the true boundary. A river coursing 200 miles through the wilds of southern Texas, its waters eventually emptying into Matagorda Bay, what is near now Corpus Christi. Their claim had merit, for south of Nueces, the Texan presence was but a ghost, a land barely touched by the foot of Anglo settlers. Yet Mexico too had left these lands barren. It was a hostile wilderness, claimed in name by both nations, but ruled by no one. A desolate battleground with no victor. When the United States finally welcomed Texas into its fold in 1845, the Texans drew a line with iron resolve. Their border was the Rio Grande, and nothing less. And so, the United States, eager to expand its reach, accepted the Rio Grande as the border in the bargain, preparing to stand behind that claim with force if necessary. This simmering dispute over borders, land, and pride would soon ignite into the full-blown conflagration that became the war between the United States and Mexico. By then, Mexico, begrudgingly ready to part with Texas, demanded one condition: that the Nueces, not the Rio Grande, be recognized as the rightful boundary, but any Texan or American hand reaching for the lands between the Nueces and the Rio Grande would be met with war, a war Mexico would fight, no matter the cost. At this volatile juncture, U.S. President James K. Polk was already locked in a delicate negotiation with Great Britain, wrangling over the northern border in the Oregon Territory. Despite his fiery 1844 campaign rallying cry of 54 degrees by 40 or fight, Polk, the pragmatist, was ready to sacrifice that latitude, content to draw the northern line of America's reach at the 49th parallel. Polk believed that if he could cool British tempers and avert war across the Atlantic, surely Mexico, battered and weakened, could be brought to the table as well. Thus, Polk dispatched John Slidell to Mexico City, armed with an offer to purchase not only the disputed Texan lands, but, if fortune smiled, all the territory stretching west to the Golden Coast of California. But Slidell never had the chance. The Mexican authorities, simmering with indignation, refused to even acknowledge his credentials, turning him away before he could present the $15 million proposal. Determined to assert America's claim, Polk sent the battle-hardened Major General Zachary Taylor with 4,000 U.S. troops at his command to the mouth of the Rio Grande, a brazen move, signaling that the U.S. meant business. The winter of 1845 to 1846, Taylor's men laid the foundations of Fort Brown, a fortress built under the ominous shadow of impending war. The Mexicans saw this as nothing short of an invasion, a slap across the face of their national honor. Orders were swiftly dispatched. Taylor's forces were to be driven out by force, no matter the costs. At the same time, Polk was hunting for a legitimate reason to plunge into war and seize all of Texas. Yet Slidell's diplomatic snub wasn't enough to ignite conflict, nor were the old unresolved claims of damages caused by Mexican raids in the days of the Republic. But in April 1846, the Mexicans handed Polk exactly what he needed. On the 22nd, their cavalry struck, engaging a detachment of 64 U.S. dragoons. Blood was shed, men were captured, and the pretext for war was born. Seizing the moment, Polk rushed a message to Congress declaring with cold precision, quote, "American blood has been shed on American soil," end quote. Though the claim was dubious, given the tangled dispute over where that soil truly lay, Congress, stirred by the cry of blood, agreed to war. Zachary Taylor, now fully unleashed, spent the blistering summer of 1846 rallying his forces and amassing supplies. By September, his army shattered the Mexican defenders in fierce clashes at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, both north of the Rio Grande. With victory in his grasp, Taylor crossed the Rio Grande, setting his sights on Monterrey. By the 25th of September, the city had fallen, its defenses buckling beneath the American advance. He wintered in Monterrey, and in February of 1847, Taylor faced Santa Anna himself at Buena Vista, where his smaller army triumphed over the Mexican forces in a stunning rout. Santa Anna, again humiliated from the loss of Texas, but back in the halls of power, tasted defeat once more at Buena Vista. His dreams of redemption utterly shattered, he withdrew to Mexico City, his forces in utter disarray. Taylor's successes, though impressive, stirred unease in the White House. Polk, wary of America's love for elevating victorious generals to the presidency, saw the writing on the wall. Taylor, a steadfast Whig, was becoming too much of a hero for Polk's liking. Determined to clip Taylor's wings, Polk dispatched the seasoned General Winfield Scott to take command. Scott, arriving at Tampico with a fresh army, absorbed the bulk of Taylor's forces and set his sights on Veracruz. From there, his eye was fixed on the heart of Mexico itself, the very capital. On the 9th of March, 1847, Scott's 10,000-strong army landed without opposition just south of Veracruz. The city stood no chance. Encircled by American forces and hammered by U.S. warships offshore, the Mexican garrison bent beneath the weight of the siege, surrendering by the 29th of March. Now holding the crucial harbor, Scott turned his gaze inland. The sweltering coastal plain, soon to be a breeding ground for yellow fever and malaria, had to be abandoned quickly. His troops marched without delay, pressing into the safer highlands beyond. On the 18th of April, Scott's forces encountered Santa Anna again, this time entrenched in a strong defensive position at Cerro Gordo. But Scott executed a daring flanking maneuver through treacherous terrain, catching the Mexicans off guard. Santa Anna's army crumbled, retreating and leaving behind half of his 12,000 men dead, wounded, or missing. Though Scott's losses at Cerro Gordo were light, just 63 men, the relentless toll of disease and guerrilla attacks began to wear down his numbers. Worse still, 3,000 volunteers, their enlistments expired, packed up and marched back to Veracruz, leaving Scott's ranks perilously thin. In mid-May, Scott made his stand at Puebla, summoning his scattered garrisons and welcoming fresh reinforcements from the United States. He remained there until early August, allowing his army to regain its strength, which now approached roughly 11,000 men, though he left behind 3,000 sick under a small garrison's care. Relying on local provisions, Scott made a bold and a controversial decision. He severed his line of communication entirely. Critics howled at the audacity. Even the famed Duke of Wellington, observing from across the Atlantic, predicted disaster would surely follow. Yet Scott's army pressed forward, slipping through an undefended pass into the Valley of Mexico, descending upon the capital. Reaching Lake Chalco, Scott launched a cunning diversion, sending one force up the main road while the bulk of his army swung southward, skirting the edge of the lake and moving past Lake Xochimilco. By the 18th of August, Scott's forces stood a mere 7 miles south of Mexico City, halted before the rugged volcanic terrain of the Pedregal, a natural barrier the Mexicans had presumed impassable. But Captain Robert E. Lee, Scott's brilliant chief engineer, uncovered a hidden path across the Pedregal, a track the Mexicans had never believed could be crossed. With this path, the seemingly untouchable Mexican position at Contreras, held by 1,500 defenders, was brutally outflanked. In the cold light of dawn on the 20th of August, the American attack obliterated the Mexican resistance. With the fall of Contreras, the roads to Mexico City lay open. But a formidable Mexican stronghold at the Churubusco River still blocked the path. Scott wasted no time. He surged forward from Contreras, driving his men hard toward the defenses at Churubusco. At the heart of the Mexican defense stood a convent, a fortress defended not only by Mexican soldiers, but by the notorious San Patricio Battalion. These were Irish-American deserters who had turned their backs on the U.S. Army, choosing instead to fight for Catholic Mexico in exchange for land and citizenship. They fought with the ferocity of men who knew their fate if captured. There would be no mercy. Yet captured they were, overwhelmed by the relentless American onslaught and the pounding fury of U.S. artillery. The Mexican defenders held on as long as they could, but when a U.S. detachment forded the Churubusco River and struck their flank, the line buckled, and a full rout began. Some argue that had the Americans pressed the rout harder, Mexico City might have fallen that very day. But Scott's troops, having fought 2 grueling battles in as many days, were too spent to pursue. It was at this critical juncture that Nicholas Trist arrived on the scene. As the second-ranking official in the U.S. State Department, Trist was dispatched with the weighty task of securing a peace settlement. By now, the political landscape had shifted. The Democratic Congress that had eagerly backed Polk's war had been swept aside in the 1846 elections, replaced by a Whig majority that had little appetite for further bloodshed. To make matters worse for Polk, General Scott, now hailed as a national hero, was also a Whig, and his rising popularity could threaten Polk's control. Determined to end the conflict on his own terms, Polk sent Trist to negotiate a swift end to the fight, offering the very same deal that Slidell had presented 2 years prior. Polk calculated that Mexico's string of crushing defeats would leave its government desperate for peace, more willing to consider negotiation than ever before. On the 23rd of August, Trist managed to secure an armistice, temporarily halting the bloodshed and calling for both sides to freeze their positions on the battlefield. Santa Anna, a clever opportunist, signed the armistice but ignored its terms. By the night of the 7th of September, Scott, realizing the deception, convened his officers to plan the next strike. Scott's spies had uncovered intelligence of a foundry at Molino del Rey, where cannon were reportedly being cast, a tempting target that seemed ripe for attack. But Molino del Rey proved to be a far tougher nut to crack than Scott had anticipated. Worse still, no cannons were being produced there after all. In what became the most brutal and hard-fought battle of the entire campaign, the Americans suffered over 700 casualties, dead and wounded, strewn across the battlefield. Despite the heavy losses, the capture of Molino del Rey gave Scott a fortified position from which to launch his final assault, an attack eastward on the Chapultepec Castle, the mighty heart of Mexico City's defenses and the home of its military academy. At dawn, on the 13th of September, U.S. forces erupted from the cover of a cypress grove, charging up the steep hill toward the towering walls of Chapultepec Castle. A delay in receiving their scaling ladders nearly stalled the assault, but the relentless U.S. soldiers finally breached the walls, pouring into the stronghold with ferocious determination. Inside the castle, the battle devolved into savage hand-to-hand combat. Mexican military cadets, some as young as 13, fought with desperate courage, defending their academy and their nation to the last man. Their unyielding bravery immortalized them as Los Niños Heroicos, the heroic boys of Mexico. But despite their valor, they were hopelessly outnumbered and could not stop the onslaught. U.S. flanking units crushed any attempt at reinforcement, sealing the castle's fate. By late morning, American troops had broken through and surged into the heart of Mexico City itself. By now, Scott's army had suffered over 850 casualties, while the Mexican forces had been decimated, losing nearly 3,000 men. Yet Santa Anna still held command of 5,000 soldiers at Ciudadela Fort and another 7,000 scattered throughout the city. Even though Santa Anna's forces still outnumbered Scott's 2-1, the city officials, fearing the destruction that U.S. artillery would rain down upon them, begged Santa Anna to surrender before Mexico City was reduced to rubble. Under the cover of night, Santa Anna slipped away, retreating to the village of Guadalupe Hidalgo with the remnants of his shattered army. Before dawn broke on the 14th of September, Mexico City surrendered to Scott. Its defenses crumbled, and its street filled with the triumphant march of U.S. soldiers. With Mexico's capital now firmly in his grasp, Scott's immediate focus was to reopen his severed lines of communication. Soon supplies and reinforcements began flowing steadily inland from Veracruz, revitalizing his forces. Meanwhile, Scott's garrison at Puebla, bolstered by fresh reinforcements, repelled Santa Anna's desperate last attempt to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Following Santa Anna's resignation, a new Mexican government was formed, and they sat down with Nicholas Trist and Guadalupe Hidalgo to negotiate peace. At this critical moment, the fate of the entire Western Hemisphere could have been reshaped if only Trist had been able to communicate swiftly with President Polk. But the slow crawl of communication between Mexico City and Washington, taking 6 to 8 weeks each way, left critical decisions hanging in limbo. Consider the maddening pace. Trist reported Mexico's initial rejection of his offer on the 23rd of July, 1847. By the time this news reached Polk, it was already the 15th of September. Polk, frustrated by the lack of progress, penned a new directive on the 6th of October, ordering Trist to return home at once. By then, Polk had set his sights on demanding even more territory from Mexico once negotiations resumed. Yet he had chosen not to reveal this, merely instructing Trist to return to Washington without further elaboration. The message reached Trist on the 16th of November, just as Mexico's new government was signaling its willingness to return to the negotiating table. Trist, still following Polk's original instructions, the same ones given to Slidell, was tasked with securing Texas, acquiring all territory up to California if possible, and paying no more than $15 million. Torn between continuing negotiations or obeying his recall order, Trist wrestled with the decision for days. In the end, he chose defiance, ignoring the recall and pressing forward with the negotiations. On the 2nd of February, 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. Mexico at last recognized Texas's claim to the Rio Grande. They ceded all lands west of it to the U.S., including California, already occupied by American forces. In exchange, Mexico received $15 million, and the U.S. forgave over $3 million in debts claimed by Texans against the Mexican government. Polk was incensed, both by Trist's defiant refusal to return and the 61-page letter justifying his actions. His anger only deepened when he learned the details of the treaty Trist had brokered. To Polk, the treaty was a meager half-victory, a shadow of what he had envisioned. Yet the Whig-controlled Congress refused to sanction further conflict, leaving Polk with no option but to grudgingly accept the deal. Even the Senate was split. The Whigs believed the treaty demanded too much, while the Democrats thought it took far too little. In the end, it was ratified as a fragile compromise, pleasing no one. The Mexican government, deeply embittered, despised the treaty, for they had never wanted to part with any land, no matter the price, but the crushing defeats left them with no alternative. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo became a bitter pill, loathed by all, yet inescapable for both nations. Had Trist never been sent, or if he had followed Polk's imperial ambitions, the southern border of the United States might well have stretched all the way to the Yucatan Peninsula. Had that vision materialized, the resources of Mexico might have belonged to the United States today. Debates over illegal immigration and trade agreements like NAFTA would have been rendered irrelevant. But consider the shorter term. What might have unfolded in 1861 when the South seceded? Mexico, had it been part of the Union, might very well have followed in lockstep. If Mexico had thrown its lot in with the Confederacy, the course of the Civil War could have been dramatically altered. Even if Mexico hadn't seceded, a cooperative, unoccupied Mexico could have drastically improved the Confederacy's supply lines, altering the strategic landscape of the war. In the end, Trist acted not out of ambition, but moral conviction, believing that Mexico should stand as a neighbor to the United States, not its conquered possession. This principled stand cost Trist dearly, his career and his future. Polk swiftly fired him. A devoted disciple of Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson, Trist could not stomach Polk's insatiable hunger for empire. In the end, the war itself realized Polk's worst fears about political rivalry. Both Taylor and Scott ran as Whigs, with Taylor claiming the presidency in 1848 and Scott falling short in 1852. Scott, however, remained in the military, still the senior commander when the Civil War erupted. His Anaconda Plan, though ridiculed at first,
would become the backbone